racist student persistently bullies his black classmate due to his skin color and financial struggles. Unknown to the bully, the underprivileged boy possesses capabilities far beyond what he imagines. Daryl Quincer stood in front of the sprawling gates of Willow Creek High School, his heart pounding in his chest. The school was magnificent, tall pillars of white marble, meticulously manicured lawns, and students dressed in the finest uniforms money could buy. But Daryl felt out of place. His shoes were scuffed, his uniform a hand-me-down that was slightly too big, and his book bag frayed at the edges. He tightened his grip on the strap, a reminder of the weight he carried, not just books, but his family's future. This scholarship wasn't just for him, it was for his mother, who worked double shifts as a waitress to make sure they had food on the table, and for his late father, who had died working as a gardener for wealthy families like the ones who sent their children to this school. Daryl's chest tightened at the thought of his father, but he pushed the emotion down. He had to focus. This was his shot, his way out. As he walked through the gate, he could feel the stares. Some were curious, others filled with suspicion, but most with disdain. He was the odd one out, the kid from the wrong side of town. His mother had warned Daryl that it wouldn't be easy, but nothing could have prepared him for the hostility that greeted him. "Who let the charity case in?" The voice came from behind him. Daryl turned slowly, already knowing who it was. Lloyd. He had heard about Lloyd Danforth before he even set foot in Willow Creek. Wealthy, powerful, and untouchable, Lloyd's father was a major donor to the school. Rumor had it that he controlled more than just the checkbook. He controlled the social hierarchy too. Lloyd stepped closer, his designer shoes glinting under the sunlight, a smirk plastered across his face. Behind him, a group of students snickered, all of them watching to see what Daryl would do. "What's the matter, Quincer?" Lloyd sneered, emphasizing his last name in a mockery of its unfamiliarity. "Lose your tongue, or are you just not used to being around people who matter?" Daryl swallowed hard but refused to let Lloyd see how much his words stung. Instead, he lifted his chin slightly. "I'm just here to get an education, same as everyone else." Lloyd's smirk widened, and he folded his arms. "You think you belong here, huh? Let me tell you something, Quincer. This school isn't for people like you. It's for people like me. You're nothing more than a token, a charity project. Don't get too comfortable." The group of students burst into laughter, but Daryl stayed silent. There was no point in fighting. He had seen people like Lloyd before, rich kids who thought the world revolved around them and looked down on anyone who didn't live in a mansion or have family money to fall back on. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" a quiet voice said from behind Lloyd. The laughter died down as everyone turned to see who had spoken. Catelyn, one of the top students in their grade, stood just a few feet away, her eyes flicking nervously between Daryl and Lloyd. She was one of the few people who hadn't joined in mocking him, but she never said much either. Her blonde hair fell over her shoulder and she shifted her weight awkwardly as Lloyd stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Catelyn, I didn't realize you cared about the charity case," Lloyd said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Catelyn hesitated, glancing at Daryl before looking down at the ground. "Just leave him alone, Lloyd. It's not worth it." Lloyd chuckled, shaking his head. "You should learn to keep quiet, Catelyn. You wouldn't want people thinking you've gone soft." He turned back to Daryl, a final sneer on his face, before walking off with his entourage in tow. Catelyn stood there for a moment, debating whether to say something more to Daryl. But then she turned and walked away in the opposite direction. Daryl watched her go, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. He appreciated her standing up for him, but her half-hearted defense wasn't going to change anything. Days turned into weeks, and Daryl found himself trapped in an unrelenting cycle. His teachers were no better than his classmates. While they never openly insulted him, there were subtle jabs, comments on his performance that belittled him, an ever-present skepticism in their eyes, as though they didn't believe he deserved to be there. In English class, Mr. Pembroke, a wiry man in his 60s with thinning hair, was handing back their graded essays. Daryl had spent countless hours poring over his assignment, crafting each sentence with care. He knew it was good, better than anything he'd written before. "Quincer!" Mr. Pembroke called out, dropping the essay on Daryl's desk without so much as looking at him. "I'm not sure this is your best work." The comment was sharp, his tone condescending. Daryl picked up the paper and flipped to the last page. His heart sank. A red C was scrawled across the top in Pembroke's hasty handwriting. "C," Daryl whispered to himself in disbelief. He glanced over at Lloyd, who sat across the room with a smug grin on his face. Lloyd's essay sat on his desk with a boulder at the top. Daryl had read Lloyd's work. He knew it wasn't better than his. "What a joke," Lloyd muttered under his breath, loud enough for Daryl to hear. "Guess even hard work doesn't fix where you come from." It was late afternoon when Daryl found himself sitting on a bench just outside the school grounds, staring out at the horizon. The day had been rough, as they all seemed to be lately, and he was running low on patience. He was beginning to wonder if it was all worth it. What if he was chasing a dream that wasn't meant for someone like him? "Hey," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Catelyn standing there, her hands tucked into the pockets of her uniform jacket. "Hey," Daryl replied, surprised that she had sought him out. Catelyn sat down next to him, the silence stretching out between them. For a moment, she might not say anything at all. "I wanted to apologize," she finally said, her voice soft, "for not saying more earlier, for not standing up for you when I should have." Daryl raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. "You don't have to apologize for that. It's not your fight." "It is though," Catelyn insisted, her eyes earnest. "I hate the way they treat you. I hate that I've been too scared to say anything. It's not right, and I know it." Daryl shrugged. "It's just the way things are here." "It doesn't have to be," she replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "Lloyd and people like him, they think they own this place, but they don't. I admire you, Daryl. You're smart, and you work harder than anyone else here. You don't deserve this." Daryl glanced at her, taken aback by her words. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like this since he arrived at Willow Creek. He had spent so much time feeling like he didn't belong that hearing someone acknowledge his worth felt surreal. "Thanks," he said quietly, not knowing what else to say. Catelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just wish I had the guts to stand up to Lloyd. He's awful, but if I go against him, I lose everything. My friends, my reputation. I hate that I care about that, but I do." Daryl nodded, understanding her conflict. He had seen it before, in different ways. People who knew what was right, but couldn't afford to rock the boat. "I get it," he said. "You've got your own battles. I don't blame you for staying quiet." Catelyn sighed, looking away. "It doesn't make it any easier." They sat in silence for a while, watching as the last of the students left the campus for the day. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the school's pristine buildings. It was a beautiful place, but it felt like a fortress keeping people like Daryl out. The next day, Daryl stood at the back of the school library, shoulders hunched and fists clenched at his sides. His gaze was fixed on the pages of his history textbook, but none of the words registered. His mind, instead, was replaying the events from earlier that morning. Lloyd and his gang surrounding him at his locker, throwing taunts like knives. "Scholarship boy," Lloyd had sneered, his lips curling in disdain. "Think you belong here, Daryl? You're nothing but a charity case." His voice dripped with malice, and the words stung more than Daryl cared to admit. Lloyd's friends had laughed, the sound echoing down the hallway, drawing the attention of passing students. No one stopped to intervene. Daryl had long ago realized he was on his own in this fight, but the worst part, the part that twisted Daryl's stomach in knots, was when Lloyd brought up Catelyn. "You really think you have a chance with her, man? She wouldn't even look twice at someone like you." Lloyd had then flashed a cocky grin and made some joke about how Catelyn had smiled at him in class, how they'd sat together at lunch. Daryl knew Lloyd was lying. He and Catelyn weren't close. She was kind to everyone, but the implication, the suggestion that Daryl could never be enough for someone like her because of where he came from, burned deep. It wasn't just about Catelyn. It was about everything he was fighting for at this school. His scholarship, his future, and his chance to escape the life of struggle that he and his mother had known for so long. He had to succeed. He had to. But every day, Lloyd and the others chipped away at his determination. The comments about his race, his poverty, the constant reminders that he didn't belong at an elite school like this. It was all becoming too much. Daryl sighed and slammed the textbook shut. He couldn't focus anymore. He could already feel the headache coming on, that familiar tightness in his temples that seemed to happen whenever he overthought about his situation. He packed up his things, ignoring the wary glances from the few other students in the library, and headed out. Later that evening, Daryl sat at the small kitchen table with his mother, barely touching the dinner she had prepared. His mother, always wise, had noticed the change in him over the past few weeks. He had become quieter and withdrawn. She knew he was struggling, but Daryl hadn't shared much. "You haven't been eating well, Daryl," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "What's going on?" Daryl hesitated, looking down at his plate. He didn't want to burden her with his problems. She worked so hard to keep them afloat, doing whatever it took to pay the bills and ensure his continued attendance at school. The last thing he wanted was to add to her worries. "It's just, school's tough," he muttered. "The workload, you know?" His mother frowned, not buying it. "You've always been able to handle the work. It's more than that." Daryl opened his mouth to protest, but then stopped. His mother didn't deserve his silence. She'd given up so much for him, and he owed her the truth. "It's Lloyd," he admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "He won't let up. He's been humiliating me every day, making fun of me because I'm on a scholarship, because I don't have money. He says I don't belong there, and it's getting to me." His mother's face softened with concern, but she didn't interrupt. She let him continue. "I've been thinking about dropping out," Daryl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I should just get a job, help you out instead of wasting time at that place." The silence that followed was heavy. His mother leaned back in her chair, her eyes searching his face. "You're not dropping out," she said firmly. "You've worked too hard to get to where you are. I won't let you throw that away." Daryl shook his head, his frustration rising. "But what if Lloyd's right? What if I don't belong there? The teachers look at me like I'm just another charity case. They're all like him. They don't care about someone like me. It's just a matter of time before I fail." His mother stood up, walking around the table to place a hand on his shoulder. "You are not a failure, Daryl, and you do belong there. I know it's hard right now, but you can't let people like Lloyd win. You're stronger than that." Daryl didn't say anything. He wanted to believe her, but it was difficult when every day felt like an uphill battle. "We're going to see someone tomorrow," his mother said suddenly, her voice steady with a quiet determination. "Who?" Daryl asked, confused. "The principal," she replied. "Mr. Harlan. He knew your father. He'll know what to say." The next day, Daryl found himself standing in front of a modest house with his mother. Mr. Harlan's home was nothing like the sprawling estates that most of his classmates lived in. It was humble, much like Daryl's own. He hadn't known that the principal lived in such a simple place. Mr. Harlan answered the door himself, greeting them with a warm smile. He was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the edges. "Daryl, Mrs. Quincer, please come in," he said, gesturing them inside. They sat in the living room, which was casual and welcoming. Mr. Harlan didn't seem like the stern figure Daryl saw every day at school. Here, he was just a man trying to help. "I'm glad you came," Mr. Harlan said, his eyes resting on Daryl. "I've heard things haven't been easy for you lately." Daryl shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure how much Mr. Harlan knew or how much he cared. "I'm going to be honest with you, Daryl," the principal continued, leaning forward slightly. "There are some things I can't fix. I can't change the way some of the students, or even some of the teachers, think. I know you've been facing bias because of where you come from, because of who you are, and that's wrong. But the truth is, this school isn't perfect. Daryl clenched his fists in his lap, feeling the weight of those words. He had known it deep down, but hearing it said aloud made it feel even more hopeless. But, Mr. Harlan went on, his voice growing firmer, there's one thing that no one can take away from you. Your mind, your intelligence. That's your weapon, Daryl. It's what got you here in the first place, and it's what will carry you through. Daryl looked up, meeting the principal's steady gaze. I knew your father, Mr. Harlan said softly. He worked for me years ago. He was a good man, a hard worker, proud. He believed in you, Daryl. He believed that you would do something great, and I believe it too. The mention of his father brought a lump to Daryl's throat. He hadn't thought about him in a long time, and hadn't wanted to because it hurt too much. His father died when Daryl was only 10, leaving him and his mother to figure out the world on their own. Mr. Harlan continued, I know it feels like the odds are against you, but you can't give up. Not now. If you leave, if you let Lloyd and the others drive you out, they win. But if you stay, if you prove yourself, you'll show them all just how wrong they are. Daryl swallowed hard. The principal's words were hitting him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent so much time thinking about quitting, about escaping the torment, that he hadn't considered what it would mean to fight back, not with his fists, but with his success. You have something they don't, Daryl, Mr. Harlan said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You've had to work for everything you've got, and that makes you stronger than they'll ever be. Don't forget that. Daryl nodded slowly, feeling the spark of determination begins to ignite again. Maybe Mr. Harlan was right. He could still succeed despite everything. I'll try, Daryl said quietly, his voice unwavering. I'll stay. His mother, who had been silent throughout the conversation, placed a hand on his arm, her eyes shining with pride. Mr. Harlan stood and extended his hand. Good. And if you ever need to talk, my door is always open. Daryl shook his hand, feeling a sense of renewed purpose settling in his chest. The following Monday, Daryl walked through the halls of his school with his head held a little higher. Lloyd and his friends still lingered near his locker, but this time, when Lloyd threw out another insult, Daryl didn't flinch. Look who it is, our scholarship superstar, Lloyd called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ready to give up yet? Daryl turned to face him, meeting his gaze without fear. Not today, Lloyd, he said calmly, and not any other day. For a moment, Lloyd looked taken aback, but then his smirk returned. We'll see about that. Daryl went back to the class, hunched over his notebook, scribbling away at another diagram. The class was noisy, filled with the usual chatter and clamour, but he had grown accustomed to blending into the background. His world had always been quieter, filled with thoughts of equations and scientific theories that often flew over the heads of his classmates. As Mr. Harlan walked to the front of the room, Daryl barely noticed, too focused on his sketch of a potential biofuel model. Attention everyone, Mr. Harlan said, rapping his knuckles on the desk to quiet the class. The state government's annual science competition is coming up. The room stilled slightly. The science competition was one of the few events that drew significant attention from the students. Winning the competition was a substantial prestige, and for 2 years, Lloyd Danforth had been the school's champion. Daryl's pencil froze mid-stroke as Mr. Harlan continued. This year, the school will be selecting volunteers. If you're interested, come see me after class. Daryl's pulse quickened. His mind raced at the possibility of participating. The idea of entering the competition had always felt out of reach, primarily because of Lloyd's domineering presence. But this time, something was different. This time, Daryl had an overwhelming urge to prove himself. The bell rang, and the students began packing up. Daryl's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Lloyd and his gang swagger to the front. He could already hear Lloyd's voice, dripping with arrogance. "Obviously, I'm in again, Mr. Harlan," Lloyd declared, tossing a smirk over his shoulder at the class. "Can't wait to win 3 years in a row." His friends chuckled, nodding in agreement. Lloyd's wins were always celebrated like personal victories for his circle. Darryl caught a glimpse of Catelyn, who gave him an encouraging nod from across the room. Darryl took a deep breath and, before he could second-guess himself, stood up and approached Mr. Harlan. "I'd like to enter too," Darryl said, his voice steady but quiet. Mr. Harlan raised an eyebrow in pleasant surprise. "That's great, Darryl. I know you've got the skills. It'll be a good challenge." But Lloyd, standing nearby, didn't share Mr. Harlan's enthusiasm. He let out a short, barking laugh. You're kidding, right?" Darryl felt the heat rise to his cheeks but refused to back down. "No, I'm serious." Lloyd's friend snickered as he leaned in. "Look, this is real competition. You won't last a day against me." "Maybe," Darryl said, forcing himself to meet Lloyd's gaze. "But I'm not doing this for you." Lloyd's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this." Over the next few weeks, Darryl dove into preparation with a level of intensity that even surprised him. He was no stranger to hard work. Late nights filled with research, experiments conducted in his garage, books stacked high on his desk. But now, there was more on the line. The competition wasn't just about winning. It was about proving to himself and to everyone else that he was more than the quiet, overlooked kid who couldn't stand up for himself. Every afternoon, Darryl met Catelyn at the library. While she didn't share his enthusiasm for science, she was always there to offer support. "I still think this is awesome," she said one day as she flipped through a magazine while Darryl pored over a chemistry textbook. "But you know, Lloyd isn't going to let you off easy." "I know," Darryl replied without looking up. "He's probably waiting for a chance to humiliate me in front of everyone." Catelyn leaned forward, resting her chin in her hand. "So what? You're smarter than him." Darryl sighed. "It's not just about being smart, Catelyn. Lloyd's charismatic. He knows how to make people like him. And when people like you, they expect you to win. It's hard to break through that." Catelyn smiled sympathetically. "Well, you've got me rooting for you. And who cares what anyone else thinks?" Darryl returned her smile, grateful for her support. "Thanks." As the competition drew closer, Darryl's world became smaller. His evenings were spent in his father's old garage, which he had converted into a mini laboratory. His father had been a gardener before he passed away, and many of Darryl's earliest memories involved the two of them working together, planting seeds and learning about the Earth's natural processes. It was in that garage that Darryl had first developed his love for science, experimenting with plant biology and sustainable agriculture. His father's presence still lingered there, in the scent of the soil and the feel of the old gardening tools. "I'm doing this for you, Dad," Darryl whispered to himself one night, surrounded by open books and test tubes. The day of the competition arrived with a sense of tension in the air. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents eager to watch the event unfold. Darryl stood off to the side, clutching his notepad and trying to steady his nerves. "Are you ready for this?" Catelyn asked as she approached him, squeezing his arm reassuringly. "As ready as I'll ever be," Darryl replied, forcing a small smile. In truth, he was terrified. Lloyd and his gang were already seated at the front, laughing and joking like they owned the place. Darryl couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The competition was divided into several rounds, each one more challenging than the last. The early rounds were relatively straightforward, and Darryl sailed through them with little trouble. He noticed that Lloyd was also performing well, though the cocky grin that had been plastered on his face all morning was starting to fade. By the time the competition had narrowed down to the final two contestants, Darryl and Lloyd, the room was filled with hushed anticipation. No one, least of all Lloyd, had expected Darryl to make it this far. "I can't believe it," Catelyn whispered from the sidelines. "You're in the finals." Darryl nodded, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. Lloyd looked rattled, but Darryl knew better than to underestimate him. Overconfidence might have been Lloyd's Achilles heel, but he was still a fierce competitor. After a long and grueling examination, the final event was announced, a live quiz in front of the entire school. The tension in the auditorium was palpable as both Daryl and Lloyd took their places on stage, standing behind their respective podiums. The quiz would cover a broad range of scientific disciplines, and each correct answer would earn points. The contestant with the most points at the end would be crowned the winner. Daryl's heart pounded in his chest as the first question was read aloud. Name the process by which plants convert sunlight into chemical energy. Photosynthesis, Daryl and Lloyd answered in unison, their voices ringing out across the auditorium. The following few questions came quickly, covering everything from physics to chemistry. Both boys held their ground, answering question after question with precision. The audience watched in stunned silence as Daryl matched Lloyd point for point. But as the quiz progressed, it became clear that Lloyd was struggling to maintain his composure. His confidence was slipping, and his answers became increasingly hesitant. Daryl, on the other hand, was focused and steady, drawing on all the hours of preparation he had put in. Finally, they reached the last question. The final question, the quizmaster announced, is a practical query on agricultural engineering. The topic is, how would you design a sustainable irrigation system for a small-scale farm? Daryl froze for a moment, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. This was it. This was the question he had been waiting for. His father had taught him everything he knew about agriculture, and those lessons were about to pay off. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, remembering his father's voice. It's all about understanding the land, Daryl. You have to work with the earth, not against it. Daryl took a deep breath and began his answer. I would design a system using drip irrigation, which delivers water directly to the roots of the plants. This method minimizes water waste and ensures that the plants receive a consistent supply of moisture. I would also incorporate rainwater harvesting to reduce reliance on external water sources and create a system of channels to distribute the water evenly across the farm. The room was silent as Daryl finished speaking. He could see the judges nodding in approval and Lloyd's bewilderment as he responded before him. Thank you both, Daryl and Lloyd, for your responses, the head judge, Miss Franklin, said, her voice clear and calm. Both contestants have shown remarkable knowledge throughout the competition, but after careful consideration, we've determined that the winner to represent our school for this year's state science competition is Daryl Quincer. For a split second, the auditorium seemed frozen. Daryl stood motionless, his mind racing to catch up with the words he had just heard. The world seemed to blur around him as the applause broke out, loud and triumphant. It was real, he had won. Catelyn was the first to react, leaping from her seat and shouting, "Yes, you did it!" The rest of the audience quickly drowned out her cheers. Even the teachers in the front row were clapping enthusiastically. Mr. Harlan beamed with pride, nodding approvingly from the sidelines. Daryl blinked, the realization finally sinking in. He had won. His meticulous preparation, his late nights spent studying, his father's lessons, all of it had paid off. He felt a surge of pride mixed with disbelief as he walked toward the stage to accept his medal. As he climbed the steps, Daryl's eyes scanned the crowd. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. People were smiling at him, acknowledging him not as the quiet, bullied kid, but as a champion. Miss Franklin approached him with a medal, offering a warm smile. "Congratulations, Daryl. You've truly earned this." "Thank you," Daryl said softly, his voice nearly lost in the wave of applause. He turned toward the audience, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt surreal to be standing in the spotlight, his name echoing through the auditorium. In the crowd, he caught Catelyn's eye, and her wide grin gave him the final boost of confidence he needed to fully accept what had happened. As he stepped off the stage, Lloyd stormed up to him, his face red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides, and for a brief moment, Daryl braced himself for a confrontation. Lloyd's gang hovered nearby, their expressions a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "You think this makes you special?" Lloyd hissed, his voice low enough to avoid being heard by the teachers. "You just got lucky. Everyone knows I'm the real champion." Daryl stared at him, the familiar fear that had gripped him for so many years rising in his chest. But this time, something was different. He wasn't the same kid who let Lloyd's words tear him down. "No, Lloyd," Daryl said, his voice firm but calm. "It wasn't luck. I worked hard for this, and you know it." Lloyd glared at him, his jaw tightening. "This isn't over." Daryl didn't flinch. "It doesn't have to be," he replied, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. "But it won't change what happened today." Lloyd opened his mouth to retort, but quickly shut it, realizing he had no ground to stand on. His eyes flickered with frustration before he turned on his heel and stormed out of the auditorium, his gang trailing behind him in silence. As Daryl watched him go, Catelyn rushed over, practically vibrating with excitement. "Daryl, you did it! You actually beat Lloyd!" She pulled him into a tight hug, nearly knocking the breath out of him. "I can't believe it," Daryl said, his voice full of disbelief. "I really won." "I can," Catelyn said, grinning as she pulled back. "You've been working your butt off for this. I knew you had it in you." Mr. Harlan approached them with a proud smile. "Daryl, that was exceptional work. You've really shown everyone what you're capable of." "Thanks, Mr. Harlan," Daryl replied, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. He glanced around at the faces of his classmates, many of whom had mocked him or ignored him over the years. But today, they were looking at him with respect. Even the teachers who had always favoured Lloyd seemed impressed. The aftermath of Daryl's victory in the school science competition sent ripples throughout Willow Creek High School. Students buzzed with gossip, some congratulating him while others still whispered behind his back. But for Daryl, the celebration was short-lived. He now had the daunting task of representing his school in the upcoming state science championship. "Are you ready for this, Daryl?" his mother asked one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. The soft glow of the overhead light illuminated the scattered books and notes in front of him, remnants of his tireless preparation. "I think so," Daryl replied, his voice laced with determination. "But I can't shake the feeling that everyone expects me to fail." His mother smiled reassuringly. "You've already proven everyone wrong once. Just focus on your hard work and let your knowledge shine. Remember, you're not just representing the school, you're representing yourself." As Daryl nodded, the door swung open, and the school principal, Mr. Harlan, stepped inside. "Daryl, my boy," he exclaimed, his voice booming with enthusiasm. "I wanted to check in and see how you're preparing for the championship. You've got the whole school behind you." "Thanks, Mr. Harlan," Daryl said, feeling a surge of pride at the support. "I'm doing my best." Good. Just keep that confidence up. You have a chance to make history," Mr. Harlan said, patting him on the back. "And remember, you've already shown that you're more than capable." However, lurking in the shadows was Lloyd, still seething from his loss. He couldn't let Daryl's success go unchallenged. So determined to undermine him, he began spreading rumors. "Did you hear?" Lloyd said one day in the hallway, his voice dripping with malice. "I heard Daryl cheated during the competition. There's no way he could have beaten me fair and square." "Yeah, right," one of Lloyd's friends replied, rolling his eyes. "What proof do you have?" "Proof?" Lloyd scoffed. "Who needs proof when you can just tell people what they want to hear? He's just a fluke." But despite Lloyd's attempts, the rumor didn't stick. Most students were still buzzing from Daryl's achievement and were reluctant to believe Lloyd's accusations without evidence. "That's just Lloyd being a sore loser," Catelyn commented to her friends as they walked past Daryl's locker one day. "Daryl really is brilliant." Despite the chatter around him, Daryl focused on his preparation. He spent hours studying, running practice tests, and refining his knowledge of every scientific principle he could think of. Catelyn often dropped by to study with him, providing encouragement and an unexpected camaraderie. "Have you gotten to the section on renewable energy yet?" she asked one afternoon as she sat next to him at the kitchen table. "Not yet," Daryl replied, adjusting his glasses. "But I'm getting there. I have a ton of notes to review." "Let's go through them together," Catelyn suggested with a spark of enthusiasm. "Two heads are better than one, right?" As they studied, their conversation flowed effortlessly. They discussed scientific theories, recent breakthroughs, and their aspirations for the future. Catelyn's encouragement fueled Daryl's confidence, and he felt a growing sense of hope for the championship. Finally, the day of the State Science Championship arrived. The air buzzed with anticipation as students from different schools gathered in the large auditorium of the convention center. Daryl stood backstage, fidgeting nervously with his notes while glancing at the other competitors. "Hey, you got this," Catelyn said, squeezing his shoulder. "Just remember what you practiced." Daryl took a deep breath, nodding. "Thanks, Catelyn. I just hope I can make everyone proud." The competition began, and Daryl sailed through the initial rounds with surprising ease. He quickly answered questions about biology, chemistry, and physics, surprising even the judges with his depth of knowledge. With every question he answered correctly, the audience's murmurs turned into cheers, and he felt the weight of their expectations lift off his shoulders. Lloyd, seated in the audience with a group of his friends, watched in disbelief. "He's not going to win," he muttered under his breath, clenching his fists. "He's just lucky." As the rounds progressed, it became clear that Daryl was a force to be reckoned with. He advanced to the final round, standing shoulder to shoulder with the top contender from another school, a boy named Marcus. The tension in the auditorium was evident as the two finalists prepared for a series of rapid-fire questions. "Let's see what you've got, Daryl," Marcus said, a smirk on his face. "You might have done well so far, but this is where it counts." Daryl met his gaze, determination burning in his eyes. "I'm ready." The judges fired off questions at lightning speed, and Daryl responded with clarity and precision, recalling facts he had memorized during his late-night study sessions. Each correct answer bolstered his confidence, while the crowd's cheers became a soothing backdrop, drowning out his earlier anxieties. Finally, the moment arrived when the judges prepared to ask the last question. The room fell silent, all eyes on Daryl and Marcus. "Your final question," the head judge announced, "is describe the process of photosynthesis in detail and explain its importance in our ecosystem." Daryl's mind raced back to his studies. He took a deep breath and gave a resounding explanation of the question. As Daryl spoke, a wave of relief washed over him. The words flowed easily, and he could see the impressed expressions on the judges' faces. When he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. Marcus, however, tried to regain control. "That was good, but let's see if you can beat this," he challenged. However, there was no chance for him again because the time was up. As the judges deliberated, Daryl couldn't shake the feeling of accomplishment that enveloped him. Moments later, the head judge returned to the podium, a smile spreading across her face. "After careful consideration, we have determined the winner of the State Science Championship is Daryl Quincer." The audience erupted into cheers, and Daryl's heart soared as he stood up, stunned. He had done it. He had not only won, but also set a record as the first black student from Willow Creek High School to take home the championship. As he walked toward the stage, the realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just his victory. It was a moment of pride for his entire community. He accepted the trophy, the cheers echoing around him, feeling the warmth of support radiating from every corner of the auditorium. "Congratulations, Daryl!" Catelyn shouted, her voice rising above the rest as she jumped up to meet him on the stage. "Thanks, Catelyn," he replied, beaming. "I couldn't have done it without your support." Lloyd's face contorted in humiliation, and he stormed out of the auditorium, his friends trailing behind him. The remnants of his gang disbanded, leaving him to grapple with the reality of his defeat. Daryl's success had been a revelation, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever doubted his potential. As the crowd continued to cheer, Catelyn stepped forward, her expression glowing with pride. "You really did it, Daryl. You proved everyone wrong." Daryl's smile widened as he reached out to embrace her. "Thanks for believing in me, Catelyn. It means the world." Watching from the sidelines, Mr. Harlan beamed with pride. This is a monumental day for Willow Creek High School, and for you, Daryl. You've shown everyone that hard work and determination can break barriers. In the weeks that followed, Daryl's victory transformed the atmosphere at Willow Creek. The news spread like wildfire, and students began to reconsider their attitudes toward each other. Lloyd's attempts to undermine Daryl's success only backfired, leaving him isolated and without support. One day, during lunch, a group of students approached Daryl at his table. "Hey Daryl," one of them said hesitantly, "we just wanted to say, we were wrong about you. You're amazing." Daryl looked up, surprised. "Thanks, I appreciate that. I just want to be seen for who I am. You've inspired us all," another student added, "and we need more representation at this school. We shouldn't be afraid to support each other." As the conversation flowed, Daryl felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. He realized that his victory had sparked a change in the school's culture, encouraging students to rise above their biases.